Good morning, dear colleagues. I'm Dr. Lala. I work with the Afro office in Brazzaville. This is our second webinar for the Triple E. Today, we will talk about the psychological support in emergency situations. Our speakers are Dr. Michel Zalamou, Mr. Mbemba Alain, Mr. Pafe Bitsindu, and Ulrich Muyele. They are the stress counselors of Afro. They have a great experience when it comes to psychological support in emergency situations. For this webinar, I will give you a few information concerning chat and asking questions. If you want to ask questions, you can use the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen to ask questions concerning the presentations, and you can use the chat functionality for IT or logistic questions. English interpretation is available by clicking on the interpretation button. You should click on interpretation and choose the language you wish to listen to. To hear only the interpretation, you can mute the original audio. Live transcription is available. You can choose show subtitles to see them, and the captions will appear on the screen. So concerning the materials and comments, this session is being recorded and your attendance constitutes consent to be recorded. The recordings will be shared after the session in English and French. Session materials, including session recordings, will be emailed to participants in the days following the webinar. Your opinion is important to us, therefore, a poll will be shared at the end of the session. So we are using the ECHO project to collect registrations, participations, questions, answers, chat comments, and survey responses for this program and share them with the WHO. Your individual data will remain confidential. This data may be used for reports, maps, communication, surveys, quality assurance, evaluation, and to inform new initiatives. So this is the agenda. I just did the housekeeping. Then we will have the poll, which will appear on the screen. It's only 2 questions. Afterwards, Dr. Michel Zalamou will make a presentation on psychological support in emergency situations. And at the end of that, we will have another poll. And if you have questions and answers, we will have that as well. And then a closing session at the end. So all the materials will be shared with you just at the end of the presentation so that you would have a better knowledge of psychological support in emergency situations. This presentation was put together by our colleagues. I will give the floor to our colleague Michel Zalamou, who is going to make the presentation. Michel Zalamou, you have the floor. Good morning, dear colleagues. I am Michel Zalamou, a psychologist. We are struggling to hear the presenter as his voice is very low and stuffy. We are going to present you with the plan as we talk about psychological support in emergency situations. Next slide, please. So this is our plan for the training session. You will talk about background and rationale and the importance of psychological briefing, then stress and its manifestations, psychological trauma, types of intervention in psychological emergencies, bereavement intervention, and then conclusion and recommendations. Next slide. So staff deployment in emergency situations has a stressful, it's stressful by nature. So if this stress is not well managed, it can lead to a lot of possible psychopathological disorders and all types of health issues. So this guide was created based on how to support deployed staff on ground. So we will talk about the importance of psychological briefing, because all deployed staff, as we said earlier, must have a serious psychological briefing. So we would give you a practical case of a colleague who was deployed and was not well prepared before her deployment, be it in her countries up to when she got to her station. A few days later, this colleague started showing signs of discomfort, which were medically unexplained. So she was sent for psychological counseling. So it is during this psychological briefing that we found out that this colleague was suffering from a series of symptoms characterized by psychological distress. And this had to do with the fact that she had poor preparation before deployment. And it also had to do with being separated from her young child, her baby. So it made it difficult for her to relate with her other colleagues at the station. So during stress counseling, we concluded that she needed to be closer to her family to be better prepared. Maybe she needed to have her husband closer to her to be in a better mental state to go through her deployment. And that was what we did. This is to tell you that psychological briefing is very important before, during, and after deployment. So it consists in psychologically preparing the deployed staff to face any type of stressful situation, to prevent the effects of stress and help her take good decisions by being in a good mental state, so that she can make choices, responsible choices, while she is at her station. Next slide. So what is stress? It's a psychological, physiological reaction of the body to adapt to a situation that can be either pleasant or unpleasant. And this is how stress, the evolution of stress, there are 3 phases. So the first one is an alarm phase, when you are in a situation that can put you in a state where you will be faced with short-circuit reactions and you will be in extreme stress situation. And this can lead to further health issues. And the second phase is a phase of resistance. And during this phase, depending on everybody's body, you can then be in a psychological defense stage where your body puts up barriers to help you cope with the first phase. And then you get to the exhaustion stage where you can have a physical ailment. So there are two types of stress. There is the type of stress that can open the door for you to propel you forward, and there's the other type that can lead you to all kinds of illnesses. So there's the positive one that gives you the adrenaline that you need to move forward, and then the second type that can actually make you sick. We also have factors of stress. These are the factors that can bring about negative stress. There are factors, family-related factors, happy or unhappy events, family conflicts, money problems. This is most of the problems that we have noticed among staff in deployment. The other factors are related to the individual's personality. You know that there are some staff members who are used to living an easier lifestyle. And during deployment, they are faced with greater responsibilities. Then they have a harder time facing their duties. And there are factors having to do with the work environment. For example, the wrong definition of duties expected from this person. And there are factors having to do with the socio-political environment and the climate. There are some staff members who could not put up with the extreme temperatures that they are not used to at their station. All these can lead to negative stress. Next slide. So a stressful state that is not well managed can lead to complications. This can, for example, create some psychological trauma, which is considered as a psychic trauma. And this is a transmission of a psychic shock by external psychic agents. Maybe a wrong word that can hurt a person's mind or soul and lead to psychopathological modifications. And this trauma can be made more severe depending on the value assigned to the traumatic event. So everyone has their value system and the education they've had, which can have an impact on how they perceive the traumatic event. So we cannot compare one's experience to the other person. Everyone is different. So the evolution of psychological trauma. I think we can take a break at this point to take the poll and allow our colleagues to ask questions if they have any before we continue. Thank you, Michelle. So while we wait for questions from our colleagues, we would have a little poll of 2 questions that you need to answer. So Alina or Justice, please, can you display the first poll?
Alina, can we quickly display the first poll? Thank you.
You have 5 minutes to answer the questions before we move on. And we would allow 2 or 3 questions before we continue the presentation.
Can we end the poll now?
Yes, I think I hand the poll now. Back to you, Dr. Michelle. No. Dr. Lala, do you want the results of the poll now? All right, Alina. Dr. Lala, can you open your microphone so that we can hear submission? Thank you. So Dr. Lala, Dr. Michelle, you're back on live and we can hear you now. You can proceed, please. Thank you.
Stress can be a good force to propel us forward when it is well managed. It is when it is not well managed that it becomes a source of sickness. The speaker's microphone is off.
Dr. Justus, we cannot hear the main speaker.
So when
Hello,
the
Dr.
stress
Lala?
is not well managed, it can induce the beginning of illnesses. If not, people who have had psychological trauma in the past and did not have this psychological briefing to prepare them are faced with psychological difficulties. So we observed this and tried to manage them. So the body enters into a phase where it simulates sicknesses to express the external suffering. So we said there are two types of stress. The first one is positive, which is a pleasant one, and that is a type of fear that pushes you forward in life. So as opposed to negative stress, which is the type of stress that does not allow you to overcome the shocking situation you were faced with. Very often we are conscious or aware that we are in a stressful situation, in situations such as losing a relative or parent, So in that moment, you're overwhelmed by sadness and your entire body is stimulated. So you are not comfortable in such situations. We are therefore going to continue the presentation. We were on the evolution of psychological trauma. When the trauma is not well managed and you were shocked by an event and you are still in that state of anger or fear over a certain period of time, normally when it goes beyond 1 month, so you start experiencing a psychological wound or trauma. And if this trauma goes beyond that period of a month, then you can start developing another sickness having to do with anxiety, which we would see on the next slide. So you could develop post-traumatic stress, which is the consequence of a suffering linked to an event that traumatized you, that shocked you, and which affects your state of mind and comes back to mind in the form of flashes or images. So everywhere you go, for example, during this training, if there are people who have internal wounds, at any point in time, they can become absent-minded and detached from what we are saying, and they start having flashbacks. And these flashbacks come and interfere with your consciousness state. And it is the image of the shock you had that would rather come to mind. There are also stimuli that are linked with traumatic events. So when you are in that state, it means you are suffering from PTSD. Next slide. So if you have symptoms linked to stress that were not well managed and you are still uncomfortable, either through dreams, nightmares, and you feel uncomfortable, uneasy, then you are in danger and you need to go and consult a specialist and let them know that this is what you are experiencing. I think in the documents we wrote, you will see that PTSD is listed among the illnesses. The international is part of the list of international illnesses. So when you are in that state of psychological suffering, then you need help, either individual psychological support for staff that are faced with the situation. So this psychological support can be given individually or in a group in context of community crisis. So this emergency intervention is not structured psychotherapy, which requires the presence of a psychotherapist. So we can teach you as a staff member to know how to manage, to have some type of first aid to manage states of stress. So when you notice a team member is behaving abnormally, so you, the colleagues, can start by helping him. So we will teach you what you need to do first. Next slide. So in emergency situations, these are the things that anybody can do. So the first stage is diffusing, to diffuse the stress. So you have the psychological debriefing, stress counseling, and techniques inspired by structured psychotherapies. Next slide. So the diffusing is an easy psychological intervention that can be conducted by any staff member to help their colleague during critical incidents. We would like to give you an example on what happened when we were deployed to some countries where we lived critical incidents.
We had survivors and people who lost their lives, and people actually got into a state of generalized panics. And this caused a lot of people to manifest depressive symptoms, anxiety symptoms. Some people who actually wanted to put an end to their deployment. So everybody has a way in which they react to stress. So the event was actually the assassination of some people who were deployed together. So it was quite challenging. So we had to begin by engaging in diffusing. You people, staff who are deployed, need to work together and see how you can help one another. The stress counselors get into action, identifying the problems and providing specialized solutions. Next slide. We were saying a moment ago that psychological first aid techniques are available in the documents that we shared with you, and they are quite easy to implement. What is most important to have at the back of your mind is the fact that you need social empathy towards people who are facing distress situations, that is in view of promoting mental health within the group. So you should try to actually water down stress among your colleagues, because stress can lead to unforeseen reactions. Somebody can hurt his colleague, or somebody can even commit suicide. If you fail to identify the early symptoms of stress and provide psychological first aid, it may end up in a very sad situation. You can ask a staff member to identify concerns of the times. That is, you can ask the staff members to provide spontaneous needs. They may need water, they may need something else before you forward their pleas to the stress counselors. So you should never harass the person in distress by forcing them to tell you what exactly is their problem. They may not want to share their concern with you at that time, so don't force to have the information. So you need to provide comfort to the staff members, help them obtain information, services, and social support that they need. You also need to protect them from eventual dangers, that is, keep them in very safe places, and eventually refer them to the stress counselors who are there to attend to them. Next slide. So self-management of stress. These are techniques which would enable staff members better manage their stress. That is, in the event of their own consciousness of a situation of stress, somebody may feel that something is not quite right with themselves. We mentioned a situation of a colleague who actually had faced some challenges. You see this person who is a rigid person who oftentimes spent their nights at staff meetings, etc. He had been totally exhausted. So he had been a victim of a myocard infarction. And we observed this person and we tried to contact this person to tell him that he was facing some challenges. We tried to provide our assistance. But since this person had a very strong personality, somebody who was not easy to deal with, we said, well, we had tried our best and this person actually shut the doors to us. It is useful for you to learn to assess the needs of your body in order to better manage your personal stress. Look at what pains you feel, general exhaustion, tiredness. All these things could be the outcome of a poor mental health state. Control your feeding actually, because poor eating habits can equally help you, can equally push you into a state of stress. Communicate more, listen to people, actually try to identify what is actually bothering you. You need to pay attention to your own needs because you can identify that you're feeling stressed out. You can decide to do a few things that you like. That would be a good way for you to deal with your stress. Next slide. So what can we do to manage stress? You can engage in sports, not competitive sports, just sports which would give you more relaxation. And such relaxation will be good enough for your muscles. Build self-confidence. Do not feel inferior to your colleagues when you are in deployment. Do not take everything upon yourself. Take it easy with yourself. You should sometimes work in a team. Build a spirit of confidence in your teams. Do not think that your colleagues are not able to do anything. So this would help you avoid surprises and some kind of trauma. You should equally sleep well, sleep enough. When your body feels exhausted, you need to have a rest. Find a confidant and actually tell them your problems, most especially specialists who are trained to do such a job. There are equally situations of bereavement in deployment. At the time when some people had been attacked, when some people from the team learned that their colleagues had been assassinated, you would see on the slide possible reactions of people who are going through such bereavement stress. The document we shared with you provides ample data on this element. So if you're in a situation with somebody who is going through bereavement stress, encourage such a person to tell you the story of the death of their beloved person. Try to obtain information on what kind of support you can provide to the people who are going through such stress. I think the way in which they would manage the bereavement is well explained in the document that we shared with you, or the document we are going to share with you. Next slide, please. So psychological care in times of crisis is provided for by specialists. And we have the following approaches to adopt. Brief psychotherapy. This would be taking into account the person's needs in the first 72 hours of the occurrence of the stressful situation. That is, you identify the extreme situations that the patient may have faced during the stress. You need to identify the problems. You need to quickly treat or prevent an escalation of the situation. So you need early diagnosis. You need to carry out stress counseling. You need to provide support with all possible modalities. And this is for the specialists in mental health. What is expected of them to provide therapeutic solutions to people who have faced very traumatic situations. We have structured psychotherapy approaches as well, which mental health experts have learned. They have a lot of techniques which they can use to assist people facing such situations of stress. I think we are actually drawing closer to the end of our presentation. So I would say emergency situations can provoke psychological disorders in staff who are in deployment. I said it is necessary to identify the causes of the stress that people face in order to avoid them during deployment. Psychological briefing of deployed staff is equally a very relevant stage for support to staff before they are deployed. Every time you identify somebody who is deployed and who has some challenges, refer them to the stress counselor immediately. And in deployment, it is necessary to always associate a stress counselor among the staff members deployed for emergency management cases. One stress counselor may not be sufficient for a big team because there are circumstances which require 2 or 3 stress counselors to address certain psychological disorders. So I believe that we have a next slide. Okay. Thank you very much for your kind attention. Thank you, Michelle. Thank you for this clever presentation. We are now going to take questions. But before we do so, we would display poll number 2 for responses to the first poll. The answer was B. For the second question, the answer is C. If you have further questions which would require answers, you can raise them and our colleagues would answer them. At this juncture, we are going to display the second poll and we would have questions and answers. Alina, kindly share the second poll, please. So you have about 5 minutes to answer these questions.
Dr. Lola, can we wrap up the poll now? Hi, Dr. Lola. Can we wrap up the poll now? Okay.
So we are going to resume our presentation. I'll give the floor now to Michelle, who will provide answers to the questions that were posted, and he will give us the results of the two polls. Michelle? Thank you very much, dear colleagues, for your questions. We have some questions that have already been answered by one of my colleagues, Parfait. And what I would like to say with regard to these questions would be that somebody who has been exposed to stress and who has received some support may be confronted to the same triggers of stress. And I would say, I would take an example of what we experienced on the field in a work committee. If you have a team lead who is quite overbearing and you're unable to put up with his personality, regardless of the assistance that can be provided to you, therapeutic advice and solutions, if the trigger is still there, you would still experience stress. We would need to now contact the team lead and tell him that he has a behavior which actually triggers stress in his team members. So if your stress is triggered by the presence of a team lead who's overbearing, you would need to at some point talk to the team lead. Or somebody who has been a victim of trauma, would psychological support be required instantly or later on? Let me say there are certain traumas which are not related to working conditions per se, that is in situations of deployment. But we have some people who are deployed, but who come to the deployment with previous traumatic situations. So when you carry out a diagnosis of the trigger of the stress, you will see oftentimes that the victim would be advised to identify an expert once they go back to their country of origin to listen to them. There are certain kinds of therapies which require a lot of follow-up. So if the diagnosis comes back at the time of deployment, if we identify the trigger of the cause, of the trigger of the stress, we would eventually make prescriptions as to what solutions could be provided, but the person would need to go back and have a long-term therapy. Thank you. I hope I've answered the questions. Alina, could you probably share poll number 2? Post-traumatic stress diagnosis is applicable to people of all ages. I would say yes. You would see some people who are quite old but are facing a lot of trauma because they are living in very difficult times. They have a psychological burden, and these people can eventually have symptoms which would manifest themselves as a post-traumatic stress for individuals older than 6? I would say yes. Because the first kinds of traumas in any human being can begin from the age of 2 or 3. So some traumatic situations may have occurred when the individual is a baby, and the person would have grown up with all those internal wounds, and these could eventually be made manifest through certain diseases. So if you carry out a diagnosis of the person's personality, you could at some point identify such situations of stress. So the answer is correct. The first one. So we cannot hear the speaker. So the correct answers, number 1 is A. For number 2, the answer is B. So for the first 4, answers were 1, B, 2, C. We are going to share with you the guide that has been drafted by our colleagues. The guide only exists in French. We are going to eventually translate it into English. The presentation is also in French, and we would have it translated into English, and you will have them in French, and in the next 4 to 5 days, you would have the English versions sent to you. Thank you so much. Do we have any other questions? We have about 4 minutes left before the end of our session. If you have questions, we can take 3 or 4 questions. So in the absence of questions, we are going to thank our friend, Michel Talamour, and his colleagues. Justice, can I hand the floor to you now? We have a question. So somebody says, I didn't hear the answers to the last 4. The answer was B. The answers were for everybody, regardless of their age. People who wrote for adults only were wrong. Those who wrote for children, older than 6 were equally wrong. So for all ages was the correct answer. Justice, over to you. Could you unmute your microphone, sir?
Thank you very much, Dr. Mulai Dikil. Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Dr. Mulai Dikil. Thank you very much, Dr. Michel. Thanks to everyone who has been part of this session. We look forward to having you on future sessions. Thank you very much, and over from here.
Thank you very much. Thank you. See you next time, and we'll continue working with you for our subsequent meetings. Thank you so much.
Thank you, everyone. Manjeet, we can close the session.